Good afternoon, everyone. Now we welcome our new panel that includes 5 speakers. This is an extraordinary panel. It is called A New State of Well-Being, Paradigmatic Changes in the Notions of Progress and Development. I will tell you briefly in this section about the paradigm change and the way we understand and measure development, and as well as the emphasis going from stressing productivity and income to more integrated models, more comprehensive. And now we will talk more about subjective well-being. So the objective now will be analyzing in more depth the adoption of the new paradigm for everybody's well-being. We have 5 speakers. We have our main speaker, Stefano Bartolini. And I will tell you briefly about Stefano Bartolini. He is researcher and professor of the University of Siena. He is a researcher on well-being and income, and he has published several key articles as the Happiness Manifesto, a manifesto for happiness, shifting society from money to well-being, money, trust, and happiness in transition countries, evidence from time series, and a last very important publication is The Decline and Social Connections, Depressed America's Happiness. Among other publications, Professor Stefano Bartolini is here today with us to open this panel, so let's greet him with a round of applause, please.
Hola, buenos días y muchas gracias al Estado de Jalisco por haberme invitado en esta interesante conferencia y en
Good afternoon, and I want to thank the State of Jalisco for having invited me here to this very, very interesting conference, and I will speak in English, not because I cannot speak Spanish, because it is because I'm suspicious that Mexicans normally speak English well, and those native English.
As you can see from the title of my presentation, I will speak about social capital and well-being, their relationship over time. The question, the central question is, what is that makes well-being increase in a country? When well-being increases or decreases, and why? We have a traditional answer in our culture, and the answer is economic prosperity. You see a summary of that. Okay, this is a good summary of this idea. An even better summary is this other sentence by Groucho Marx, which says that life is plenty of things that are more important than money, and the part of the sentence which is not appearing says the problem is that they are extremely expensive. And this is a very good synthesis of especially of the thinking of economists about the role of money. Money is not an end; it's a mean for living better, for having a better life. Can you go to the next slide? Is this true? Let's please have a look to this graph. This is the relationship over 15 years between changes in life satisfaction and changes in GDP, economic growth. Changes in life satisfaction are on the vertical axis, changes in GDP are on the horizontal axis. As you can see, there is no relationship. The fact that in a country life satisfaction increases or decreases is not related to economic growth. The relationship is, the regression is almost flat and non-significant. I have a problem with this. Can you skip? Okay. In this graph, I substituted to GDP the changes in associational activity, which is a measure of social capital. Social capital is a measure of people connections, of how much, of the quality and the quantity of relationships among people. And associational activity is a good measure of it, because it is a measure of how much people act together for a common purpose. If you heard John Halliwell this morning, you will realize that it is something which is very important for human beings. These are the same countries, same data on well-being, same time span, but as you can see, life satisfaction is largely predicted by changes in social capital. These two graphs in practice say that economic growth does not predict changes over time of life satisfaction, but these changes are largely predicted by a measure of people's sociability, in this case, associational activity. In particular, the share of a country's population which belongs to at least one association. This is what happened over the long run, 15 years. If we shorten the time span, passing to the medium run, like 6 years, I also will change in the next graph the social capital variable, which is trust in this case. And this is what happens. These are three variate regressions of happiness, first, second column, or life satisfaction, third column, which is regressed on trust and economic growth, change of GDP. The coefficient of social trust is very big and highly significant, but GDP is also begins to be significant. This is a typical result of the happiness literature. Economic growth does not matter for increasing people's well-being in the long run, but if we shorten the time span, economic growth begins to become important. Social capital is still very important, even if you shorten the time span. These data are taken from the European Social Survey on a time span of 6 years. They have in that survey 3 observations, because they do biannual observations. So these 6-year periods can be split in 3 sub-periods of 2 years, biannual periods. I do the same exercise on 2 years period. Here, in this slide, the results from the medium and the short run are compared. The result is that social capital in the short run matters much less. The coefficients in both happiness and life satisfaction regression are much smaller and less significant. GDP follows the reverse path. In the short run, it becomes very important for people's well-being. So the message of this data is that when we ask what makes well-being increase or decrease in a country, the answer depends on the time span considered. If we are talking of the long run, the right answer is social capital is very important. And this is important from the policy point of view, of course. We should focus policies on social capital. But as the time span shortens, social capital becomes less important and even unimportant in the short run. So the message is social capital is important for durable happiness. But in the short run, if we want a short run increase in happiness, we can continue to be obsessed by economic growth, as contemporary societies are, because it works in the short run, but it doesn't work for durable happiness. So my message is durable happiness strongly depends on the evolution over time of social capital. This is confirmed also by within countries data. I will show you now some data from the countries which experienced the most well-known episodes of decrease in well-being. First of all, the United States. American happiness declined in the past 30 years. This data arrived just before the beginning of the economic crisis. And the trend is declining. Why is it declining? We made a study using American data of the past 30 years, and the result is that there are forces that affect the average American happiness in different directions. The first is economic growth. Economic growth raised American happiness because people in individual data, if they have more money, they are on average happier. And this is true especially at low levels of income. So the economic growth of the past 30 years increased happiness in the US, but it actually decreased because other things weren't very badly. I'm talking of two things. The increase in social comparisons and the decline of social capital. This is what social comparisons are. I think the vignette is clear enough. It's the tendency of people to compare each other. Of course, economic growth works for increasing well-being if what is important for well-being is to have a bigger car. But if what is important is to have a car bigger than your neighbor or your colleagues, then economic growth doesn't work, because economic growth gives a bigger car to your neighbors and to your colleagues too. So social comparisons doesn't work tends to offset the positive effect of economic growth on well-being. And then there is the decline of social capital, which has been remarkable in the US in the past 30 years. Loneliness became a mass problem. It concerns now tens of millions of Americans which are without social contacts, and loneliness is an enormous problem from the point of view of happiness. And also, and it was not like this 30 years ago. And also those who have social contacts often experience difficulties of communication, conflicts, difficult relationships. People feel isolated. Families has become extremely unstable. It's a society with a very big difficulty in building stable relationships. When the weddings decreased, divorces increased, cohabitation decreased, separations increased. Very big difficulty in establishing a stable relationship. And then there are generational cleavages. The relationship between the society of adults and the society of youngsters, I mean children and teenagers, are very difficult in the US. Big conflicts, big difficulties of communication, and then trust dropped. This is very disquieting data because it dropped sharply. Moreover, social contacts decreased, social contacts with friends, neighbors, relatives, solidarity, honesty, social participation, civic engagement, they all dropped. All these measures are strongly connected to happiness. And the story of the decline of American happiness is very simple. The positive effect of economic growth was more than offset by the sum of the negative effects of the decline of social capital and of the increasing social comparisons. So this story seems to have a clear message. It is not economic growth that matters for well-being. It is the social quality of economic growth. If the price to be paid for economic growth is to reduce the society to a desert, then it is not worth. But the story of the decline of subjective well-being doesn't end with the United States. We have examples, very important examples, from developing countries. In China, between 1990 and 2007, average life satisfaction fell by 7.1%. And in India, it fell even more. 7.6% in the same period. And these data are even more astonishing than the American data, because these are countries which are experiencing a mass transition from mass poverty to the satisfaction of basic needs. So it is really astonishing, this. We made a study on the Chinese and the Indian case, and this is briefly the results. The decline in life satisfaction in this period can be explained by, I don't know if you can see this, by the increase in social comparisons and the decline in social capital. These are the two big, two negative histograms. The two big factors affecting the decline in life satisfaction. The Indian story is very, very similar. What explains the decline in life satisfaction is, again, the decline in social capital and the explosion of social comparisons, even stronger in India than in China. So, surprisingly, the major stories of the Easterlin paradox, the decline of subjective well-being in growing economies, are explained by surprisingly similar factors, because despite all the enormous historical, social, economic, institutional differences between the US, China, and India, the story of the decline of their subjective well-being appears to be surprisingly similar. Increasing social comparisons, which are fostered by a context of strongly increasing income inequalities, which is something which these two countries share. Increasing inequality makes social comparison explode. And the other part of the story in common, these countries have this in common, is the decline in social capital. As far as China and India is concerned, we have trust, associational activity, and civic behavior. So, the story of the decline of subjective well-being in this country seem to tell this story. Private affluence has been faced by the increasing poverty of relationships. The increasing affluence of what is private has been faced by the increasing poverty of what is common, because relationships are a common good. This is the world that we risk to create with the obsessive insistence of our society, or societies on economic growth, which means obsessive insistence on a society which obsessively stimulates possession and competition, but possession and competition give problems to the quality of relationships. These two contrasting aspects, social crisis on one side, the crisis of relationships, and economic dynamism on the other, because we are talking of the three most celebrated cases of economic growth between developed countries, the US, and and among developing countries, China and India. So we are talking of successful growth stories. So is there a relationship between social crisis, the crisis of relationship on one side, and the economic dynamism on the other? We developed a theory on this. I'll give you simply the intuition. Social capital, the decline of social capital creates emotional distress, because as you have seen, social capital is a very important contributor to well-being. And there's material affluence offers a compensation for emotional distress. This is something that usually psychologists understand very intuitively. It's more difficult to explain to my colleagues, economists. But material affluence can be a compensation to emotional distress. Moreover, social capital provides people with goods and especially services. And these goods and services, when they decline, because social capital is declining, can be substituted by market goods. people resort to the market to compensate for something which was common and was free, because it was provided by social capital. This creates demand for goods, and this boosts economic growth. I'll show you some examples of what I mean, referred to the American economy. But the point is that, in turn, economic growth can worsen social capital, especially because it spreads individualism and materialism. And studies from positive psychology show that more materialistic people have worse relationship and enjoy lower well-being. So the spread of materialism can be at the basis of the kind of trends that I showed you. And in fact, there's an enormous evidence of the increase of materialism in China and in the US, for example. So this is a vicious circle in which people react to relational decay by increasing their purchases, and thus creating economic growth, but economic growth can in turn decrease their social capital, and this a self-feeding mechanism whose result is that one: more private wealth, more common poverty. How founded is the idea that economic growth can decrease social capital? Here, in this slide, you see the relationship of a big sample of countries between economic growth and three measures of social capital: group membership, trust in others, and a measure of civic behavior. As you can see, this relationship is negative. This means that the greater economic growth, the lower line of subjective well-being in growing economies, are explained by surprisingly similar factors, because despite all the enormous historical, social, economic, institutional differences between the US, China, and India, the story of the decline of their subjective well-being appears to be surprisingly similar. Increasing social comparisons, which are fostered by a context of strongly increasing income inequalities, which is something which these two countries share. Increasing inequality makes social comparison explode. And the other part of the story in common, these countries have this in common, is the decline in social capital. As far as China and India is concerned, we have trust, associational activity, and civic behavior. So the story of the decline of subjective well-being in this country seem to tell this story. Private affluence has been faced by the increasing poverty of relationships. The increasing affluence of what is private has been faced by the increasing poverty of what is common, because relationships are a common good. This is the world that we risk to create with the obsessive insistence of our societies on economic growth, which means obsessive insistence on a society which obsessively stimulates possession and competition, but possession and competition give problems to the quality of relationships. These two contrasting aspects, social crisis on one side, the crisis of relationships, and economic dynamism on the other, because we are talking of the three most celebrated cases of economic growth between developed countries, the US, and and among developing countries, China and India. So we are talking of successful growth stories. So is there a relationship between social crisis, the crisis of relationship on one side, and the economic dynamism on the other? We developed a theory on this. I'll give you simply the intuition. social capital, the decline of social capital creates emotional distress because, as you have seen, social capital is a very important contributor to well-being. And there's material affluence offers a compensation for emotional distress. This is something that usually psychologists understand very intuitively. It's more difficult to explain to my colleagues, economists. But material affluence can be a compensation to emotional distress. Moreover, social capital provides people with goods and especially services. And these goods and services, when they decline, because social capital is declining, can be substituted by market goods. People resort to the market to compensate for something which was common and was free, because it was provided by social capital. This creates demand for goods, and this boosts economic growth. I'll show you some examples of what I mean, referred to the American economy. But the point is that, in turn, economic growth can worsen social capital. Especially because it spreads individualism and materialism, and studies from positive psychology show that more materialistic people have worse relationship and enjoy lower well-being. So the spread of materialism can be at the basis of the kind of trends that I showed you, and in fact there's an enormous evidence of the increase of materialism in China and in the US, for example. So this is a vicious circle in which people react to relational decay by increasing their purchases and thus creating economic growth, but economic growth can in turn decrease their social capital, and this a self-feeding mechanism whose result is that one: more private wealth, more common poverty. How founded is the idea that economic growth can decrease social capital? Here, in this slide, you see the relationship of a big sample of countries between economic growth and three measures of social capital: group membership, trust in others, and a measure of civic behavior. As you can see, this relationship is negative. This means that the greater economic growth, the greater is the decline of social capital over time. This is on a big sample of countries. Of course, this is a correlation of time series. It is not yet a causal test. So we instrumented economic growth. I have to be quick on this, and those who don't have a great econometrics training may have problems in following this part. But instrumenting a variable is a way to observe the causal relationship, and this is the causal relationship. The relationship, the dependent variable is is the variation over time of social capital, and independent variable is economic growth, instrumented. So this gives the causal relationship from economic growth to the change of social capital. And you can see three columns. The last two columns result from the split of our sample in two parts. Countries with a high increase of the Gini index, which is an index of income inequality, and countries with a slow increase, a slow increase in income inequality. And the result of this is that economic growth decreases associational activity when income inequality increases quickly. When it doesn't increase or increase slowly or even decreases, the relationship is not significant. This means that the negative impact on economic growth, on social capital is connected to high level of increase of income inequality. The same result can be observed for the second variable, trust. When, when the Gini index increases slowly or doesn't increase, the relationship is not significant. But it is significant when income inequality increases rapidly. For the third variable, civic cooperation, the index of civic behavior, again, we have the same result. In the part of our sample, which is two-thirds, where income inequality increased slowly, the relationship is not significant, and it is significant, highly significant, in the part of our sample where income inequality increased rapidly. So it seems that inequality plays a very important role in the relationship between economic growth and social capital. Economic growth tends to destroy social capital when income inequality increases rapidly. Otherwise, the relationship is non-significant. How this view can explain some growth episodes, in particular the episodes I mentioned, the US, for example. I mean, the idea that the decline in social capital boosts economic growth because it boosts the development of entire sectors of the economy. For example, the industry of security in the United States rose rapidly as a share of US GDP, and the security sector is strongly dependent on trust. The decline of trust, according to Putnam, tend to boost the development of the security sector. Plus 40% increase in police and guards and 150% increase in lawyers and judges over the levels that would have been projected in the 70s. This is the result of the past 30 years. The share, look at this number, which is astonishing. The share on the total labor force of work supervisors and guards are police, correction officials, and security personnel, remained stable between 1948 and 1966, around 10.8%. This is a share of the labor force. And then began to grow. At the end of the 70s was 13.4, and at the beginning of 2000 it was almost 18%. Thank you. Almost 18% is a big number. This means that almost 1 American out of 5 works for maintaining discipline in its society. These numbers are made by security personnel and work monitors, work supervisors. It's a very big number, which has no comparison in other rich countries, and which gives a very important contribution to the growth of American GDP. Because these people are all paid and their income are calculated in the national American income. How many problems must a society have in order to allocate 1 out of 5 of its workers to maintaining discipline? Very big, and the mirror of this is then the abnormous number of American jailed population, which was more than 2 million since the 2000s. 2 million is an unprecedented number in the world history as a share of the population or of the total labor force or whatever. Just to give you an idea, on this planet, 1 out of 4 prisoners is American, but Americans are only 5% of the world population. It's an unprecedented number. These numbers, I hope, makes my message clear. To live in a society where social capital declines, where social connections disappear, where trust gets eroded, is, first of all, extremely costly. And it contributes to economic growth, not only of the security sector, but also of other sectors. For instance, the home entertainment, a sector which experienced an enormous boom in American economy in the past 20 years, it can be seen as an industry of social isolation because it is based on the loss of social character of leisure time. When leisure time gets privatized, the home entertainment sector booms. Vacation, the industry of vacation, other booming industry, but for instance, the unlivable social and even environmental climate that we have created in our cities, how much does it boost the industry of vacation, the need for vacation? Healthcare, as Biswas Diener said this morning, happiness is a very important predictor of health. But there's another very important predictor of health that epidemiologists know very well, social capital. People which have a higher risk to get ill are the socially isolated or those with difficult relationship. Social poverty is a major risk factor for health. And the healthcare system in the US is the most costly all over the world. How much of this other booming industry is due to the decline of social capital? I skip on this because also suburbanization can be seen in this light, and I go to the conclusion. It is not economic growth. Sorry, I lost the slide. It is not economic growth that matters, but it's social quality. If the price of growth is the social decay, then it is not worth, as in the example I gave you. So this data suggests a shift of policy priorities from growth to social capital and well-being. Policies for social capital, I just have a look at this slide as a shopping list because I have no time. Any one of these points would require a single seminar. I wrote a book on this, on policies for social capital. We should change the way our cities are organized. We should change the way our media works. Our way to work, and especially firms' organization, is an engine for dissatisfaction and unhappiness, and it's not worth from the point of view of productivity, and should be changed. Our schooling should be deeply changed, and our health system also. Income inequality is another thing that damages social capital, as I showed you before, and also our democracy needs changes, but I have no time for this because they gave me the red card. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Stefano Bartolini. Thank you very much for that presentation. Without any doubt, it was a very interesting topic you just elaborated on, which will allow us to move inside this topic more in depth. All the speakers' presentations will be uploaded to the forobienestar.jalisco.mx, and you can follow this on the Facebook page as well. And there's a Twitter page, and we are a trendy topic on a national basis. I was recently informed about this. Now we have four magnificent presenters. We have Mariano Rojas, who's an economist from Costa Rica, but he was adopted by Mexico for many years now. He's a researcher at Flaxo, Mexico. Then we will have Alejandro Adler. He's a Mexican-American psychologist, or maybe just Mexican or American, we don't know. He has been adopted by both countries. He graduated from the Pennsylvania State University. Then we have Victoria Guiarizo from Argentina. She's an economist and a research professor at the University of Buenos Aires. And finally, we have Hector Salazar. He's a Mexican economist who focuses on regional development sectors, and he works at the BID, or the Development Inter-American Bank. We will follow on the line of thoughts as presented by the speaker. So first and foremost, we will hear from Mariano Rojas. A big round of applause, please. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the government of the state of Jalisco and David, especially for having invited me to this event and having the opportunity to share some ideas on this paradigm shift. I believe that we will put the presentation at any given moment now. The technicians are working on that. But without the presentations posted up, we will go back to what Stefano was saying. We're moving from a paradigm that dominated the 20th century and that started in the 19th century, and that's a progress paradigm based on economic growth. And we are moving towards a more humanized paradigm. It's closer to people, and that is the progress based on happiness and well-being. Having said that, we will be moving around those paradigms and we will have great changes. As an economist, I would like to underscore one of these major changes I am referring to. We are moving from one dominating figure that controls the media and the press and textbooks of economy, which is the consumer's role, to a more real character, which is the person, not the consumer, but the person. We always listen to these factors. I would like to invite you to read economy books where you will hear from the consumers. What does a consumer do? Well, the consumers consume. And where will well-being be provided from this perspective? Well, from consumption. Now we are moving to a different paradigm. People are not only consumers, they are not only workers, they have a family, they have their beloved ones, and they have broken hearts. For example, songs in the 40s are famous for that. For example, one shuts the door and you will never go back. And that is a broken-hearted person. But in any case, we're talking about humans that are in love, that love life, people like you, people like myself. And maybe some of the people might be worried about their children, whether or not they are back home and safe, especially those that are younger kids. So those concerns pertain to part of this audience, but in any case, it's because we are human. And Johan Lee, as well as Stefano, have mentioned this quite often. The presentation is not up yet, and I will continue to speak. In the meantime, I am buying myself some time. I'm looking for my flash drive. One moment, please. So, here we are. This is a paradigm change and public policies. This is what I was mentioning before. We are moving from that old paradigm to the person instead of the consumer. And we will be focused on well-being and not so much on consumption. And of course, this had great implications for public policies as well as for the strategy and the conception of development. What are we looking for from a society standpoint? We want ever-growing economic benefits, or should we looking for positive affection, not so much the negative affection, and the joy of accomplishment before the failure? Let's see some examples as to how the growth-based progress is filled with examples. This is just a piece of the newspaper referring to the SEP, which is the Ministry of Education in Mexico, and it states that the Ministry of Education urges to strengthen the human capital so that they can be more competitive. So they understand that there have to be competitiveness and skills in place so that knowledge, which is taught at school and at universities, so that they can become more productive. As a matter of fact, when we talk about economy, we talk about investment. All those that know economics understand that investment means risk of consumption. So investment is you go to school not to be happy. You go to school so that you sacrifice and get a degree, get the knowledge, so that in the future you can get a job. And we have that as part of the theory, economic theory as well. You continue working so that every 15 days you get your paycheck, and with that money you can purchase items or assets and you can be happy. All that is part of the common education foundation. Let's listen to what Rudolph Giuliani was hired in Mexico City. He is very pleased to understand, well, back then, that the criminal rate was decreased in Mexico City. He, however, did not understand the broken heart of all those that walk at night. He was only thinking about investment and tourism. This quote on the lower part of the slide shows what Rudolph Giuliani said with regards to the criminal rates. And he was only focused on tourism and investment instead of thinking about the families that suffer from criminality and lack of safety. Next, we go to progress as economic growth. But we don't see any human beings on these slides, so the human being is no longer part of this scope, of this view. And Stefano was talking about several examples similar to mine. We talk about the consumer, so the overall idea is to consume, but human beings have disappeared from the picture. And most of the people present here today must reside here in the city of Guadalajara, and this is Jose Clemente Orozco's mural. This is the Wheel of Progress. It's painted on one of the most important buildings here in the city of Guadalajara. And this mural is important, very important, because we understand how the wheel can turn and we don't know where it is heading. It's an industrialized item. And if you can go to the Cabañas Institute, you will notice that in the lower part there's some human remains. Humans. And this mural expresses the fact that people are pillars. Maybe they are triturized or milled on this progress that have marginated them, have isolated them. So they are one of the many pieces for this gear. Now, the 21st century progress paradigm is a new one. It's more focused on human beings, the humans, and focusing also on children. This is a type of progress that has been adopted in many entities. There's a UN resolution. As a matter of fact, I believe that nobody has mentioned this United Nations resolution, but the UN is inviting us to work towards happiness. Now, the Mexican government plan starts off with a statement by the president. He states that he would like to have Mexico where everybody can write his or her own history of success and be happy. This is the Mexican strategy, and it's close to what the UN has stated. We have a number of books that refer to progress and paradigm shift, and you can download all this information. These are perspectives from Mexico and Latin America. I would like to next move to two major topics. Very briefly, we have to understand well-being, and I differ from some standpoints I have heard from so far. For example, well-being from the academic standpoint. And there's an index that is a compound index, a factorial compound with statistics and anything you want to add to it. And hence we understand well-being. However, I believe that well-being is something we live on a daily basis. You understand whether or not you have well-being or not. There's no expert that can come up to you and tell you that well-being is part of your life. We have always had well-being ever since we became humans. Now, indicators that are built by the experts don't often do not coincide with the facts. So, Professor Leo, during his speech, Leo Bormans, talked about the concepts and how far away we are from those concepts. People know about sorrow and pain and anguish, but frequently we don't know anything about academic perspectives. This is a song that I hope that everybody knows. Is by Violeta Parra from Chile, and Mercedes Sosa sang this song. Why do we thank life? Gracias a la vida means thanks to life, or thanking life. I have not heard any other piece of music that talks about economic growth. I invite you to listen to the radio on a daily basis, and that says we are not growing at 7%. We are not growing, and that's a servo. There's no song that sings that, and there's no song in the world that tells us that growth is important. It tells us that it's an instrument and not the end point, and ingress or income should be part of the formula, not the formula. So it has to be used for our well-being, for our happiness. So Violeta Parra talks about the sight, the sound, appreciating life. She also talks about, with very strong voice, because it's a Latin American woman, and as Stefano said, human relationships are of most importance. So Violeta Parra talks about the mother, the friend, and the brother or sister, and we as Latin Americans understand what this means. Maybe not so much about growth and $40,000 per capita income, but we do know what a mother and a brother and a sister and a friend is. We also talk about, or we hear in this song about laughter and tears and joy as well as sorrow. This is what we have to build upon, and not something the academia will build for us. Now this information talks about life satisfaction, and there's essential experiences for well-being. All human beings know about failure and success. Of course, humans have different aspirations and goals, but we all know when we have made it or when we have failed. We know that there's negative aspects, we know that there's fear, and we also know whenever there's a positive feeling, whenever there's pain, whenever there's pain inflicted on us. These are experiences that are widely known. And there's a test I always give my students. Students are asked to go to their grandmothers so that they can understand the well-being. Well-being is something the grandmother understands. If you and she cannot have a conversation, then you don't understand what the well-being is. You have to get closer to what other people feel and understand what other people express. Over the past 20 years, for instance, there has been scientific studies. We have data. You have seen regressions, econometric analysis. So all in all, happiness is not only important, but it can be measured. We don't need to go ask the experts. We need to go ask those that are happy. It's subjective. Why is it subjective? Well, because it's based on the actual subject. We have had a number of surveys. We understand that we are more than consumers, much more than consumers. The income is important, but it's not the most important factor. And finally, we know that life is not only the level of life. The level of life is one of the many aspects, and human relationships are so important. You noticed on Violeta Parra's song, she said mother, friend, brother and sister. So we are talking about the colleague, we're talking about the neighbor. And finally, we have the idle time, or leisure time, which should not be considered as unproductive. It is important. When we have a leisure time, this is an important resource from the happiness perspective. You can be working and being gratified economically, but it's also important to have loneliness at any given moment outside the social context. But it can lead to happiness, and you can have well-being just for the sake of it. Now, the overall challenge is to work on public policies And public policies is for human beings, not for consumers. We have to underscore that. We have, of course, the relationships, we have gratifications and gratitude as well. There's a number of elements to it, and we have to rethink about concepts that have been around the development strategy. The first one being the fact that people are human assets, and we have to teach them knowledge for their productivity. We oftentimes forget that we need to teach the value so that they can get connected to people, they can have relationships with their children, with their significant another, and with the colleagues and so forth. Now, the relationships should be, ever since we entered the kindergarten, this should be a major subject taught at schools. I have 4 minutes. Oh, 5 minutes. Not 4, 5. I need that we need to incorporate this knowledge right from the educational perspective. We need to promote non-materialized values. We have seen that material values generate self-esteem problems over time, and they also generate problems of other kinds. Benjamin Franklin stated that those that believe that money can do anything for them will do anything for the money, and anything or doing anything includes even murder or killing anybody for money. We need to teach children that money is just an instrument. Money is not what should guide us, it's not our master. As a matter of fact, money is for our service. We should be the masters of money. We have to teach values. We have to teach core values for coexisting with others. We live in a society and we have to connect ourselves with others. And we have to teach that ever since we're in elementary school. There's a list here on this slide. I will not go in detail, but as Stefano stated, the interpersonal values and human relationships are of most importance.
And many of them need time. There is nothing won if we work more and sacrifice our time with our family, children, and friends. We need time. We need to get far away from that vision that other people are my means to ascend. So this is something that we Latin Americans have, and that is drinking coffee at noon, having lunch together, hugging each other. When I got to Mexico, you know that Mexican hug, Mexican embrace is truly warm, and we end up by holding hands. And this human warmth has to be included into policies. Infrastructure, for example, is not a household. It is places where we get along. They are places where we can design houses so people live in getting along with others. That's what we call habitability or livelihood. We have to think as communities. We have not to provide, we should not provide household solutions, but community places where your neighbor is your friend. And architects know how to design this. They know how to promote all these attributes. We need to feel proud of our cities. That is something as well. And we have to think about leisure, the value of being idle, and trying to create from the public policies spaces where this leisure time is gratifying instead of being this loneliness, being alone, where one gets enclosed in our houses because we are afraid of getting out, but also because there is no infrastructure that allows us to go out in a group, like running a marathon or going out on our bikes on Sundays. And we have to find how to generate work that does not only pay salaries, but that are gratifying to the people. We spend from 8 to 10 hours a day at work, and there are many hours. These are many hours of our lives, and this shouldn't be hours we suffer to be paid every fortnight. And there is, of course, a study on labor satisfaction, social programs, and very briefly, this is an area we have worked a lot. Everybody talks about bringing people out of poverty, but they don't say where should we place them, or they say let's take them out from poverty, and it is not enough, and we have studies on this. So what's happening? The green line is what we want to bring them out of poverty, but we want to bring them in satisfactory life conditions. And this brown line says they are of poverty because they work. The lady works at day, the father works at night, and they never get along with their children, and they are going to have problems with their children later on in life. They're going to have marriage problems, marital problems. So we have to approach this as well, and this is a shift of paradigm. It is not neither a larger or smaller state. It is a state that aims to have well-being in an efficient manner, and we are on the right path. It is not arguing about subjective and objective indicators. The discussion should be about what indicators get me closer to the people's experience, whether they are objective or subjective. And it is not the aim to obtain an income. The income is the instrument. We need to measure the productivity of income in terms of happiness, work on this, and then enlarge our scope. I think that based on this, we're going to have a more human progress that people will identify in that, and we're going there. And of course, I have the red card, and now I leave you with these two quotes: the worst sin a man can commit, and another one from a very well-known Mexican actor, are two responsibilities. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Mariano Rojas. So I didn't mention this, but I will say this very briefly. He has a PhD from Ohio State University. He's a member of the National Board of Researchers Level 3. He's elect president of the International Society for Quality of Life, and he is the author of several books, as it is the Scientific Study of Happiness, and he's the editor of the Handbook for Happiness Research in Latin America and co-editor of the book that is called Global Handbook of Wellbeing and Quality of Life. Thank you. And next, well, I want to tell you that Mariano Rojas and Alejandro Adler were two very important collaborators at this forum. Next, we have Alejandro Adler. Alejandro is a psychologist. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a star student at the PhD of psychology, and he has Martin Seligman as his supervisor. They got together with other 8 experts in Bhutan to talk about global development, human development. He has worked with experts from India, Peru, Bhutan, and China to talk about positive psychology and measure the impact of all this on the youth. He has published both academically and non-academically. So let's welcome Alejandro Adler, please, from the United States. Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. It is truly a privilege for me to be here. I want to thank the government of the state of Jalisco for having invited me here today. Today, I am going to talk about a territory that seems specifically fertile to me and not so much explored. It has been not so much mentioned in this forum. Mariano talked about it briefly, but it reflects a whole in well-being science, and it refers to childhood and adolescents well-being. So I'm going to start by a quote. I think one of the finest human beings we have had the privilege to live in the same era as he did when he accepted his Nobel Prize. He said, "Education is the most powerful weapon to change the world." So I think that the natural question that comes from such a statement would be, what's education? Or more specifically, what is the aim of education? So this is a question that is similar to what is the purpose of progress if we measure it merely on economic growth, when the academic paradigm that directs the world is that income is going to be based on academic performance. So what I'm going to propose today is that an education system that is efficient, effective, will prepare human beings in an integrated and comprehensive manner, not to live only successfully at a professional level, but to have life fulfillment. So prior to address this question, I want to give you the context of the work we have made. As you probably know already, in the year 2012, the UN proposed these 8 objectives for the millennium. These are formidable. They are so much admired, but they are all related to reduce suffering in terms of health, in terms of access to elementary education, in terms of access to nutrition, gender equality, and so on. And I can repeat, these are all admirable objectives. They are valid from every stance. And what we found after 10 or 12 years, although 5 of these 8 objectives were moving towards being achieved by the year 2015, it was seen that by setting out the barriers, the disabling barriers at the different communities and the poorest countries mostly, will not guarantee that these communities or these countries would flourish, that they would move towards getting rid of discomfort and truly achieving well-being. So then, after a resolution for well-being was passed as an objective for development, there was a summit at the UN in New York, and it was led by Bhutan, that was held in April 2012. And from then on, as Wenceslao already mentioned, there was a summit at Bhutan that was held by the beginning of 2013, and the question was, beyond getting rid of human suffering, what can we aspire to? What can we aspire in order to improve human condition beyond 2015? And it was when at Bhutan, where they have been measuring and using the well-being as the compass for their public policies and their institutional architecture, we collaborated with the Ministry of Education, and we started from beginning by the intrinsic value of happiness and well-being. So, through culture, through time, it has been acknowledged that a perennial objective for human beings is to have a fulfilled life. Aristotle said, "Life is the happiness is the meaning and significance of life," and the Dalai Lama has said something similar. Confucius and many others have said happiness is so important, and when we can agree that there is a value adhered to happiness as an aim in itself. And as it has been mentioned, well-being has also an instrumental value. Well-being has positive effect on all kinds of life dimensions. It includes physical health, interest for our community and our environment, creativity increase, and specifically for teenagers, it yields in less alcohol and drug abuse, less prejudice, higher income, and so on. And well-being will work as a way of prevention against anxiety, against depression that have turned out to be a global epidemics, as you already know. So now, after having started collaborating with the Ministry of Education at Bhutan, we started working with the human flourishing model that Seligman proposed in 2012 that has been mentioned earlier today, and it is PERMA, this acronym that includes the hedonic elements of happiness, but also emotional well-being, engagement, positive relationships that provide trust, love, reciprocity, being able to have an aim and feel the sense and have a meaning of life, and as well as accomplishment or self-efficiency. So, what is positive education? It is a paradigm of learning that remarks, first of all, the importance of well-being as a right, as an objective of education. But more than this, it is the importance of well-being for academic success as well as other positive consequences. So it is not a model that says economic success or well-being. It is both a synergy between academic success and well-being, and it proposes that an educational system that is authentic, what Aristotle proposed 2,000 years ago, should provide tools to the students to be academically successful as well as to have fulfillment in their lives at all levels. And in the past 20 years of research, we have learned that the tools and well-being habits can be taught and can be learned. There are ingredients of well-being, and I will talk briefly about them. And when I talked about the intrinsic value and the instrumental value of well-being, this should be taught as tools. So what have we learned in the past 4 or 5 years when we have worked with this at schools, starting at Bhutan, but also repeating this throughout the world? First of all, it has been that it is mostly about introducing the concept of positive education to the educational community. It is not only to teachers, it is not only to principals of schools, but we need to include parents, students, so they can internalize the importance of this new model of education. The second step is, the previous screen, it is teaching the tools for well-being, for obtaining well-being. This is something that we have included as an independent subject, the same that students undergo Mathematics 1, Math 2, Math 3, or tools. Tools for life should be the same according to their own culture. We will name them differently according to the culture. And as a third item, it would be infuse all the curricula with a positive psychology and the relevance of the culture and the local environment. It is truly a change in terms of education for including, in this case, well-being and environmental issues to the education of both children and teenagers. Now, why did we choose Bhutan? Because we said, if there is one place in the world with all the enabling elements where this can work, first, it is a country that for 40 years has been adopting this well-being as a compass, and there was no necessity to convince them, so we were invited by them, and it was truly a pleasure. We started working with them by taking the measurements of the baseline and then incorporating or including this well-being curricula that we included both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. And what were the tools that we decided to include to the curriculum? After being 4 months in Bhutan, understanding their local culture, bringing the best intervention based on empirical data, and by interacting through these pilot sessions, these were the 10 tools that we included in the final curriculum. Number 1, full presence, or what is called mindfulness in English. Mindfulness, empathy and altruism, physical exercise, resilience, or the capacity to be able to face challenges of life and able to transcend them, self-awareness, critical thought or critical thinking, decision-making, communication, creative thinking, and understanding and emotions management. And once again, as it has been said, this is something that we teach as an independent subject, and it was also imparted, or it was immersed in the psychosocial fiber of these schools, of these academic institutions, both inside and outside the classrooms and with all the participants. So results after 13 months of working with this curriculum, we held a controlled experiment. 11 schools were intervened with this curriculum. We had controlled schools, and after 15 months, the schools that got this curriculum, they increased the PERMA levels very significantly. And not only that, but after having finished this program 1 year later, these results continue to be significant. Differences between controlled schools and intervened schools. And when talking to the students, they told us this is totally different. It is totally different from learning history, for example, where we are memorizing and we are learning by heart only to pass the exam. Now these tools are going to be used on a daily basis in our daily lives, and we can attest results if we use these tools, and this becomes a virtuous circle where these tools truly become a self-sustainable inner model for these students. And we were amazed, not only because this had an effect on what our original initial objective was, that those students who were attending schools that were intervened, they also increased performance significantly, much more higher than those controlled schools under standardized examinations. And the Ministry of Education, they applied these tests on a yearly basis, and these schools obtain better scores. So this underlines the fact that well-being and academic performance is not one or the other. They complement each other, and they have this reciprocal relationship amongst them. And other results were better health, physical health, better satisfaction with the school experiences for students, teachers, and directors, increase in attendance, and better positions in leadership. And finally, at these schools, there was the creation of this well-being ecosystem that now has been brought to the whole country. 507 schools. Bhutan is a small country. They are implementing this curriculum for everybody. And the key question after such results was, can we repeat these results in an environment that is not necessarily as good as it is Bhutan, where they already have well-being as their national compass? Then from Bhutan we move to Nepal, who are neighbors to Bhutan. Nepal is a similar country in some aspects, but they continue to use the GDP as their national progress index. Their population is almost 27 times fold that of Bhutan's, and since February last year, we have introduced our programs in 25 schools in Nepal, and we have schools from the highest levels of income to the lowest, and our preliminary results have proved that we have obtained similar results. We have increased psychological well-being, increase in academic performance, and then we said, okay, so now the real challenge, India. India is truly a country that has all kinds of cultures and people. Those of you who have visited India, you know it is fascinating but chaotic. It has 1.2 billion people, and we have worked for Teach for India, the Gandhi Foundation, and we have programs in more than 500 schools at India. And once again, our data, quantitatively and qualitatively, they're saying that there have been similar changes in terms of the school's ecosystems, students' performance, social well-being, and so on. So, Finally, South Asia includes India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka that have 1.6 billion people together. This is a subcontinent that is extremely young. A billion people are in school age or college age, but we found very clearly that there is another fertile land, and this is Latin America in Peru. We found the Minister of Education is very enthusiastic about these initiatives. There was a collaboration through the World Bank with the Ministry of Education in Peru, and now we're working with 700 schools. This is an experiment. Once again, it is a random experiment with 350 schools being intervened with this curriculum, and then we have other 350 schools as control. We are implementing this curriculum right now, but we have seen so far positive results. We still need to measure after our intervention in order to get these real results. In Mexico, pioneers definitely are Tech Milenio, who have, and they really deserve a hand for sure. Tech Milenio, this university, they have truly emerged the DNA, and this is not only for students who can come out from the university with an employment. No, they have their purpose of life, and they rely on the tools to get them. And Hector, Escamilla, and the Institute of Happiness Sciences, led by Margarito Tarragona, they have made wonderful work, and they have more than 40,000 students in 30 campi. And it has been a pleasure for me to collaborate at Tech Milenio. They are an example to follow here in Mexico and Colombia. We're working with individual schools, and the question for Jalisco's challenge now is to open the dialogue at a local level and later on at a state level on what education means, or in brief, what do we want for our youth. And once we define, or once they in Jalisco define this, how can we measure education dimensions beyond academic performance? What are the instruments that democratically we can use to capture these dimensions that refers to success beyond academic success? And what kind of programs will allow us to form this educational paradigm that will foster the integrated well-being of our country? And truly, I firmly think, strongly believe, and not only as an idealist that I am, this is because I've seen it, this is the way to plant the seeds for the new paradigm for global development, and truly materialize what Nelson Mandela wanted to say when he said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And with this statement, I finish. Thank you again, and a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you. Thank you. We thank Alejandro Adler for his participation. And next we're going to have with our speakers, we have Victoria Jarrizo. She has a PhD in economy from the University of Buenos Aires. She's an expert on the topics of well-being, experimental economy, poverty perceptions, and she's also professor on epistemology of economics, methodology of social sciences, as well as a seminary on integration at the School of Economic Sciences of Buenos Aires University. Let's welcome Victoria with a round of applause, please. Well, being an expert on well-being, it seems too much to me, but I will try to say something interesting after having listened to so many interesting things this whole day. First of all, I have to tell you, it is a pleasure to be talking about such an important topic to today's economy as well-being is. But about this question that this panel proposes is a new state of well-being. This is a question that makes me feel restless, and it makes me restless because when we hear the politicians, ministers, candidates for government positions and economic policy makers, they all have a point in common, and it is that they all agree that the objectives of policies are to improve the quality of life of all people. All programs, social, economic, political, are a kind of bridge that will allow us to obtain a larger attain a larger objective, which is general well-being. But as a paradox, we need to say and we need to stress something that is very little what we know, what governments know about the people's well-being. It is very little what they know about the population's well-being, their needs, their expectations, their problems, beyond the problems that have big names as poverty, as income distribution, unemployment. And this lack of information possibly has to do with the fact that we continue to be tied up to a concept of well-being that this modern society is not valid anymore, to this classic concept of well-being that has been promoted by the state of well-being and the standard economic theory. This concept is a very simple one. The classical vision of well-being is understood as the absence of problems or deprivation, but the objective has been tried to equal the income distribution and to try to improve the well-being of the most vulnerable groups of population. But the only thing is that they only try to be a political solution to these great social contradictions. But this state of well-being that for so many decades we have followed, mostly because it was easy to follow, easy to quantify, easy for governments to say that a country improves and society progresses by measuring the GDP, by measuring income. And also, when we think about this, we have not lots of information on what they are really or truly about. This state of well-being, this way of understanding well-being is today under a crisis. This is a paradigm in crisis for several reasons, and this is why I will try to focus my speech in this next 16 minutes and 45 seconds I have.
Let's talk about this paradigm. Let's talk about why it is a crisis. I will talk about the failures that are so evident. This is a paradigm that has failed, given that it has not solved the basic needs, the first order needs. We could work on a list, an endless list with numbers and figures confirming over and over that there's poverty, there's malnourishment, and there's failures when it comes to income distribution. And there could be a number of societies, for example, England or Switzerland, where it might have worked. You know, the well-being model might have worked, but from a general standpoint, this has not solved the most urgent and mandated problems in the society. Secondly, when we get in touch with the population, we clearly understand very rapidly that the analysis based on their well-being does not coincide at all with the analysis made by the government based on reading these objective markers and core values that are used for the general consensus. And the general consensus does not coincide with the reality. I cannot read my slides, so I will move the microphone and read this slide to my left. So we can try to understand what the statistics state, the macroeconomics relate, and what the population tells. So, three aspects. And there's a disassociation, and I highlighted three, which are the most important for the objective of my topic. We have the quantity fallacia, and that means that the myth that by appointing more resources to the most vulnerable sectors, there will be instant well-being, and that's not true. We can see the great number of programs worldwide for social perspective, and we know for a fact that results cannot be attained by allocating more and more money. We have to understand that there's embezzlement, and embezzlement takes place, and racketeering also happens, and that's because of the lack of understanding of the problem. I will give you a very simple case. In Argentina, the country I come from, there's a program, and in essence, it's an excellent program because it's a social alimony or help of 700 pesos on a monthly basis, 700 Argentinian pesos for every child, and that would be roughly $50 on a monthly basis, designated per child. We have many dollars, but this is the blue dollar, as we call it. And in any case, this money is allocated for all those families that are under the poverty line, under the minimum wage, and that in addition have no fixed income. So this will ensure universal incomes. But there's a great difficulty, despite the fact that the government uses this program for the well-being improvement. And Argentina's current model has social inclusion. Well, so they say, because 3.5 million children are receiving this money. However, the program generates many distortions, one of which is the families that have 5 children, for example, that's the maximum, 5 children receiving this money, so it's $250 monthly. So the family, of course, will not move away from poverty, but they do move away from the labor condition. One of the conditions is not to work or not to be part of the labor. So people don't work, otherwise the subsidy will be taken away, or they work in the informal market, the black market as we call it, with all the inconveniences that this generates. The truth of the matter should be all the way around. It should be an integrating, comprehensive program that could give the subsidy for a given period, contributing for social inclusion, so that the parents, the mothers or the fathers can be part of the formal labor. This is a serious situation as we speak. These people, as time passes by, the program has been around for 5 years now, should be reinserted in the labor world, and that's not happening. So this is one of the many disassociations that lead to the lie based on quantities, or the myth based on quantity. Many well-being status are considered so because of the budget that supports said programs, without actually understanding whether or not the problem is being overcome. The second disassociation has to do with the aggregate overstatement, and that means that believing the GDP's growth will automatically lead to well-being. And the third disassociation is subjectivity overstatement. And this is the lack of public policies, the needs, the expectations of people are not seen, are not heard. In Argentina, in the year 2001-2002, which was one of the most serious crises in the country, led to situations where there was 50% of the population below the poverty line. A high percentage of people that were not poor, based on official statistics, felt themselves as very poor. So we worked on a poverty perception index, finding that almost half of those that apparently were not poor, based on official statistics, felt as poor. Based on that, and as of the year 2001, we continued analyzing this, and in the year 2005, we worked on a well-being index. This index is a qualitative one that is based upon questions that we ask people so that they can evaluate how they feel on different sectors. sectors that we have analyzed as important ones. For example, job, health, housing, and income, amongst others. Education is also part of this. And we created then this index. I will very briefly explain. The methodology we used has to do with same indicators used for trust index or reliability indexes. What we understood basically led to the disassociation of what statistics showed on GDP growth and what people reflected on well-being. Very rapidly in Argentina, which grew very rapidly over decades, but dropping in the year 2005, 2006, and 2007. One moment, I have to go one slide back. As of the year 2007, the economy continued to grow at very high rates, but well-being continued to drop. Basically because growth was under many economic distortions, high inflation rates, and the unemployment rates were somehow manipulated, and we have poor workers, as we have denominated this group. The incomes they perceived could not allow them to overcome the poverty line. So there was disencouragement. People felt that they were better off when working, but when they finally could get a job, the income was not sufficient. So there was insatisfaction. We also researched these questionnaires and the findings, establishing contact with the people. And when doing so, we started to see what their true feeling was. 77% of the households, based on one of these indicators in the year 2013, clearly stated that they had very bad or deficient incomes, so that they could not achieve the quality of life that they expected, that they aspire to. And we also have a group that was discouraged because of the quality of their jobs. They worked very long hours, and some of the talks have reflected on this as well, how people have to work many hours and then they do not feel satisfied or fulfilled. And the last indicator for poverty sensation indicates that the household incomes are below the line for minimum coverage of the main needs. So 70% of the people, at least based on this survey, manifested that they felt somehow poor and below the poverty line. Next, we have the results of those factors that decrease the well-being, the economic well-being, and of course we have inflation. Inflation in Argentina has been at a rate between 25 and 35% on a yearly basis. Also low income, job problems or job-related problems, and by that we mean the low quality of the jobs that are granted to the people, or insatisfaction, or being more trained or capable as opposed to the jobs that are being given to them. And these are typical situations in Argentina. I stated before that there were at least 3 reasons why the well-being paradigm was in crisis. I, of course, talked about failures that the classic well-being model could not solve. Secondly is the disassociation between what the governments state or analyze and what people actually reveal. And the third has to do with the clear situation that is, without any doubt, a factor that is totally different and disassociated from what people believe is well-being. For instance, we no longer have the quantitative value. People have a job, but they also evaluate the quality of these jobs, whether or not their rights are respected, how many hours they work, And the same thing happens with the health sector. In Argentina, we have public hospitals and public education. So it's not only access that people are qualifying, but furthermore, the quality of these services. So we could work on a new concept for well-being, and that is an outstanding task. But it's very clear that the well-being paradigm is in crisis. And when one comes to think whether or not a new well-being status should be granted, well, for the time being, we have many surveys, many studies, and many metrics that reveal that problems derive from different sources. We need to see into those, first and foremost, so that we can analyze the well-being status. Of course, studies gather information, surveys gather information, but there's no such thing as a theory that can explain this better or in a better way. And finally, we understand that the society should move towards a more humanized well-being that takes into consideration the rights and the quality of life. And I would like to wrap up by saying, or mentioning rather, important factors so that the well-being status can be understood in a better way. We need to work on a perception and a definition that should not be a general one, but one filled with words or interpretations that are politically based. We want to give this concept some contents, real contents, not just words. Secondly, we need to have measurements in place. We need to work very hard because we see numbers and metrics here and there. For example, the one that was firstly initiated here in Mexico by the Statistics Bureau. And it's pretty good, but we need to know how that information will be used for public policies to be generated. And thirdly is the generation of a responsible agenda for policy planners. Public policies planning should include all this very wealthy and rich information that derive from social, human, and economic problems, so that the well-being platform can be focused on. And finally, the fourth item has to do with the new state that has to be created. So we have to move away from economic social programs. We need to analyze micro problems or those tiny problems here and there and focus on those. One very brief example. In Argentina, the health system is a public one that is an important and relevant system in place, guaranteeing that all the population has access to health. But if you go to the inner part of the country, if you go to the public, they will, if you have a cavity in your teeth or any tooth, it will be pulled out. But your dental problem is not solved. Many people have no teeth because of a micro problem that is not solved from that standpoint. That's well-being. Well, well-being is not only the aesthetics. Well-being goes beyond that. People that don't have teeth in place or when needed for their overall health will not feed well, and of course there will be no education, and this is a micro problem that is turned into a macro problem. And now I have 52 seconds, and in order to wrap up in 52 seconds, let me tell you what I believe the new well-being model is or should be. We have had a contradiction from a political perspective, but the new well-being has to be focused on economic perspectives. Politics can no longer be the objective. Well-being cannot be connected to politics and getting votes. But furthermore, the objective has to be the well-being, and politics is just a tool. And finally, poverty and distribution, all these beautiful terms we always hear in discourse, should be taken on responsibly. This morning, we heard students claiming for the 43 students, Mexican students, that disappeared and were abducted. When the governors stopped talking, one of the speakers say, how can well-being be granted without justice? And that's the question all countries in the world should reflect on. Well-being should not be a cliche or a slogan, not anymore, for beautiful discourses by politicians. It has to be taken on responsibly. Thank you. And now I got the red card, so I have to stop speaking. Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria Galizo, for your presentation. I, of course, gave her the red card. After a while, I let her finish somehow. And next we have Mr. Hector Salazar. And Hector Salazar graduated from the University of Pennsylvania and from the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. And he has a specialty in urban and rural development areas. And he has been a professor at the Demographics School in Mexico City. And he's part of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Please welcome Dr. Hector Salazar. Welcome. Good afternoon. My role is a very hard one because it's very hard to differ from my colleagues. I was in the academia in the past, and I worked right on the frontier of creating and generating debate and provoke this type of discourse. Now I have a position at the BID, and I am the manager with 26 entities or state members that are part of this Inter-American Development Bank, the BID. And I would like to acknowledge what has happened in the region, where the region is located. And it's not only nostalgic memories, but also trying to understand with very few indicators where the region has been positioned. And finally, I will talk about the paradigm, but not from the intellectual and a scholar standpoint, as my colleagues has stated, but furthermore, I will talk from the Inter-American Development Bank standpoint, what we can do to support the member countries. In order to do so, let me tell you where we are as we speak. The GDP is a relevant indicator. It summarizes the economic performance, and it helps public policies. And to a certain extent, it gives us a clear idea as to what the population looks like. It's like an X-ray or plate talking about the material performance. It also talks about the social economy, and it is a thermometer for the government to measure the country. The per capita GDP also shows the average economic well-being. And when we compare countries over time or countries amongst one another, we can see the average. This has been extensively presented this morning, and economists know what I am referring to. And this graph shows a number of countries, 6 different countries to be more precise, in Latin America. And we could understand, for example, that Chile is 4.5 times better in terms of their conditions as opposed to somebody from Nicaragua, or 2.2 times better as opposed to one citizen in Peru. It's pretty common then to have international associations taking into consideration this type of analysis, aggregated analysis that is. And in Latin America, we know for a fact that over the past 12 years, this positive aggregate can lead to our understanding of growth. However, there's disparity or inequalities when comparing ourselves to Latin America, and furthermore, when we compare ourselves to the rest of the world. Despite the fact that we have these numbers and markers, we understand that gaps between countries, or amongst countries, I should say, have been enlarged. For example, Argentina, Chile, and Panama, with the per capita growth at higher numbers, and when comparing them with all those that have less numbers, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, will lead to threefold in terms of gaps. In the past, it was 2 times. So from the year 2000 and the year 2014, the numbers were increased by 50% when comparing the same groups, the same state members. The GDP, however, has obvious weaknesses, not only because the differences amongst the populations are not clearly identified, those that do not benefit from growth. We have heard quite intensely that populations, whether we're talking about a perception or reality, don't often know what is actually happening to them. And this is more a fact in some countries. On the graph to the left, we can see that up until 1990, the GDP and the GDP per capita was growing, and poverty decrease was not dramatically noticed. But from the year 2000 and on, the ratio is close, apparently. And that's where the population perception has to be taken into consideration, as well as the differentiation amongst the countries analyzed. The graph to the right clearly states what was said before during the previous panels. There's no guaranteed growth or well-being growth when when the income is increased. And we have the year 2012 for analysis, and the question is still in the air. The GDP is an economic measure. It does not include relevant problems, for example, crime rates or transportation costs, contamination, and it means transactions. It measures up transactions, not stocks. This is very important also to understand the climate change. Furthermore, it does not measure up the population satisfaction levels. The GDP was not created for that, but that doesn't mean that these factors are not important. They have to be taken into consideration. We have the PDP, GDP downsides, and they have been overcome by the countries in Latin America. For instance, we know for a fact that the development plan and inequality values within the Gini coefficient and other factors, for example, education and nutrition, have been incorporated to these indicators. And more recently, we have heard about distribution factors. The income inequality can be explained by something that goes outside the scope of the individuals. We have gender, we have age, and educational level of the parents that can in turn explain what these factors refer to. So it's not the GDP per se, but it's another series of factors that can be incorporated for proper modeling of incomes and expenditure on a household basis. Now, when we talk about the well-being distribution, we will have this reflected on statistics at a regional level, and practically all the countries represent that there has been progress regarding poverty and lagging or progress in other categories. Categories that include other sectors. And we have satisfactory methods or indexes, and we know that, for example, Colombia is a pioneer when it comes to multidimension factors. Altogether with the UNDP and other international associations, we have methodically understood how these measures can be reflected on policies designed. This has applied in other countries as well. Throughout Latin America, and it's important to underscore this, that based on the United Nations global initiatives have progress. For instance, most of these commitments you have heard about these commitments, have to do with constant monitoring so that quality of life is increased. In the 1990s, we had the Human Development Index. We also have the Millennium Development Objectives, which are 8 with 48 indicators and a number of targets. And Latin America has, all in all, progressed for coverage or access, but we still have some lag in when it comes to quality. And most of this is blamed upon other factors, external factors. Now, these initiatives were translated into interpretation of data, and most recently we heard about the Poverty Monitoring Index, and we now have sustainable maintenance or sustainable economy. We had 17 objectives with 169 goals, so 9 plus when comparing to the Millennium Development Plans. So we understand that growth in Latin America are no longer progressing that fast. I'm talking about the region aggregate. We have to understand which countries, which regions will differentiate from the others, and which agenda will apply based on these millennium targets. This is still outstanding topic. Learning amongst the countries to monitor growth was substantial when analyzing these initiatives. So there has been a gradual progress with this regard over the past years. However, countries have not progressed when it comes to quality of life monitoring. As you all know, there's still an outstanding issue with regards to education and health of people and how that can be monitored, as well as their participation on political processes, the natural and social environment in which people live, and what will define the personal and economic safety. It's important then to always include all these factors, all these measurements when measuring inequalities. We have objective measures that are the classic ones, and maybe with the exception of what I heard about the Bureau of Geography and Statistics, I have no knowledge of any other type of attempt to incorporate all these dimensions within the income and expenditure surveys that will be carried out in the future. Mr. Soho said this morning what will be included. This is important progress. Despite it all, the region mandates for objective dimensions to be included. Without any doubt, all the countries need to move forward when it comes to well-being, when comparing to Canada, for example, or using the United Kingdom well-being national measures, and what was mentioned with regards to Bhutan gross national happiness index, as well as the OECD and the life betterment index. And we have a close relationship with the OECD, and we will evaluate 11 aspects for well-being, which are very close to social capital. We have housing quality, incomes, education, community overall well-being, security and labor equilibrium, as well as personal equilibrium. So all this is very ambitious, and it's discussion in progress through methodology and through the OECD committee, and the BID are currently working in a co-joint effort as to how we can contribute.
And there are some examples I would like to mention that are occurring now in Mexico. Later on, or tomorrow, you're going to listen about Mexico's example. There is a survey performed by CESOP, which is the Center for Objective Surveys from the Chamber of Congress, and a study from the Institute of Social Sciences. And they try to measure the perception of Mexicans in different scopes that conform the quality of life. in Chile. In Chile, the national CASEP survey that has been performed for 30 years or more in these efforts about Latin America, they have incorporated a question about satisfaction of life since 2011, and they will continue to do so. In Peru, the national survey for household, they ask questions about governance, transparency, corruption, and the perception of level of life. I really congratulate the effort that we have heard from Adler in regards to education and the experimental evaluation for Peru, which is a model so necessary. Hopefully, we are going to have more information about this. The bank is making similar assessments on teachers, similar to that which is happening in Peru. We are going to analyze several cohort studies, including Jamaican's study. I skipped for educational coverage. You can see that basically Latin America advanced critically to reach full coverage as a great challenge for this millennium. On the right, you will see the results obtained from PISA, this survey company, compared to the OECD data, and the best Latin American countries in terms of academic year and mathematics, specifically only 1.6%. From 1.6 to 2% as Chilean example, for example, they have been able to achieve satisfactory grade in terms of these levels that are considered satisfactory in order to decide there is academic performance from students at the appropriate level. So Latin America and the countries here specified actually are lagged behind considerably. So in terms of quality, we have many more challenges to come, more than coverage. Sustainability is another very important topic and critical to Latin America. Estimates tell us that climate change will cost $100 million per year to the region, and the cost to adaptation to the impact is only going to be 25% of the whole impact estimates. This is giving us an idea about the importance. We have not heard to climate change experts today, but people in our organizations who are experts on climate change, they say this is a measurement that has not only to do with flows but also with the stock, because fixed capital and natural stock will influence internationally in the future. So we have a very big problem, and we are working from the methodological standpoint. And I will say that from the GDP, it is an important indicator, but it is insufficient. Latin America, they want to concrete in these regards. And it is important to take into account what we have heard today to measure these important subjective measures and adding them to objective measurements. What is the Inter-American Bank doing? Since 1997, the Inter-American Bank started leading an initiative that is called Measurement for Surveys and Improvement of Quality of Life. And today we have received from these 25 countries members that include the surveys on households. We have provided the analysis data that is provided by, or we yield information to policymakers, and we have invested on a platform that is called Social Meter that includes relevant information that is schematized about all these surveys. And I want to finish by saying, in these 3 minutes I have left, the paradigm. What are the things that I think we need to do? We are working with different countries who are members of the Latin American Bank. We, in our philosophy, and this is something we share with many countries, our philosophy is that we have to work with the life cycle. Life cycle from the first 1,000 days of life in a child born up to preschool age, and the transition into school, transition from school into labor. Today we have high unemployment rates of the youth, and people, it is declared that young people they don't study nor work, and then we have to transit to old age in order to try to minimize the risk of living old age in poverty. We have to address problems related to to the pension they will receive later on. So we have to address this, added to the large groups of poverty, and these are not now anymore highly transmissible diseases, but those diseases related to modernization that relate to the behavior of people, anxiety, and so many that relate to low quality of life, as well as relativity in the different populations. If we consider the family as a core and the life cycle, we think these are the basis for the paradigm that comes from the state of well-being that thinks only in terms of consumption, and then now we have to think of well-being that will generate activities that will yield in income. But we have to consider the family as a nucleus and to consider transition, because we have the baby, the child, the elderly that got retired, and the mother or father that sustain whole families together. So these are not sustainable topics. These are sustainable topics we have to consider as a group. So therefore, we need to adopt a perspective. Whatever each country adopts, we as institution, we as bringers of added value and practical knowledge, we should not forget the life cycle, family nucleus, and nuclei, and advance in terms of social agenda and based on income level. Very careful, because the relationship between these two programs that relate to social security and social protection have to be very well discussed in order to not generate incentives that have not been foreseen, and that countries, we are sure, are going to have difficult times in the next decade. The boom that we saw last decade, led by very few countries, is going to finish. Now we are going to enter a stage where the growth pace is going to be much slower. So we need to pay attention to these new paradigms and what we have heard today. And I congratulate all my colleagues here for their magnificent ideas. I know for sure that we will study this in my institution, and it is truly an honor for me to be here present in my own country.
Bueno, pues todo resumen es injusto. Y lo haré muy brevemente. Hay coincidencia de que el nuevo paradigma no es suficiente, se dejan cosas fuera que son también muy importantes. Es importante reconocer las relaciones personales, el capital social, el medio ambiente, la satisfacción de la vida, otro tipo de cosas que no se encuentran en un Producto Interno Bruto. Sin embargo, como bien mencionan, el paradigma nuevo todavía no está completo y está en construcción. La buena noticia es que tenemos interés por seguir construyéndolo y que estamos dispuestos a experimentar y seguir estudiando nuevas formas de incorporar los aprendizajes para mejorar el bienestar y la calidad de vida. Muchas gracias, un fuerte aplauso a este magnífico panel.